Good morning, everyone. I'm Suzanne Lawson with Constellation Consulting, and we are pleased to present the 2020 New Mexico Summit on Health Equity virtual series. This series is funded by the New Mexico Department of Health Tobacco Use Prevention Control Program and will take place each Thursday through June 25th. For more information about the summit and our upcoming presentations, please visit our website at nmhealthequity.org. While originally intended to be an in-person summit, the 2020 New Mexico Summit on Health Equity became a virtual series this year due to COVID-19. We appreciate the efforts of everyone involved in transitioning this event online, including our presenters, the Department of Health, Alliance Audiovisual, and the members of our Constellation Consulting team. For our session today, attendees' webcams and microphones have been disabled. If you need assistance during the session, please utilize the chat feature within Zoom. If you have a question for today's presenter, please use the Q&A function and we will address as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. Any materials provided by today's presenter will be posted on our website at nmhealthequity.org. Following today's session, you will receive an email with a link to an online evaluation. If you would like to receive community health worker or social worker CEUs or continuing medical education units, you must complete the evaluation. CEU certificates will be emailed out within 30 days of completion of the evaluation. And finally, before we get started today, we are excited to offer you all an additional way to engage and connect with others participating in this year's Summit on Health Equity virtual series. As an illustration of our continued growth as a community, we invite you to participate in our virtual mosaic. This mosaic will be built over the next 6 weeks and will be made up of photos that you all send in to us. You can send in one photo or several. They can be a view of those that you may be with during this time, or even images that you find that that are inspired by this week's presentation. To be a part of this, please send your pictures and images via email to info@constellationnm.com with the subject Mosaic. The Mosaic will be live on our website beginning on Monday, May 25th, and we will continue adding photos each week. Today, we are excited to host Dr. Jamal Martín as our first presenter in the Summit on Health Equity virtual series. Dr. Martín has a distinguished career of administrative, professional, technical, and clinical experiences in community health and prevention medicine. He has conducted interdisciplinary teaching, research, service, and public health practice in epidemiology within local, national, and international settings, including with the World Health Organization and UNICEF. As a past director of the University of New Mexico's Peace Studies program, Dr. Martín recognizes structural violence as a global health challenge and advocates for strategic peace-building education and health diplomacy. His current research focus lies in forensic epidemiology and public health law studies and mind, brain, and education sciences. You can read his complete bio on our website at nmhealthequity.org. Please welcome Dr. Jamal Martín.
Thank you, Suzanne. And thank you, attendees. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here to share what I know in terms of this New Mexico 2020 Summit on Health Equity. And so, without further ado, let me begin. But before I get into the meat of this matter, let me say that the information that I'm providing you with is my perspective on my views and my professional experiences. And I guess the disclaimer is this is not the views of the Health Sciences Center. So, resisting pathologies of power and place. And the focus on this really has been about the opportunities to achieve optimal health experiences for all population groups and communities. And I think at some point, this is really about bringing theory to practice for an inclusive culture of health. So I'm going to start off with the learning objectives. I have 5 learning objectives, and we're going to start off with the first one. But before I get into this, if you notice at the bottom of the screen, I have one of my favorite words that I give students. and that word is metacognition. And if you don't learn anything else today, at least act on this particular word, and I'm going to define it for you right now. Metacognition is thinking about thinking while thinking to improve your thinking. Let me repeat that. Thinking about thinking while thinking to improve your thinking. And I think this is a necessary concept because the critical problems that we need to solve today really require a great deal of critical thinking as well as creative thinking in many ways. So with this first learning objective, we're going to review and recall the importance of ecosocial models and the role of social epidemiology in support of health equity. But before we begin that, I should say that we need to do an analysis of power and leadership, okay? And as we talk about analysis of power and leadership, keep in mind the types and sources and the agenda setting. And so in highlighted in yellow here, I have power over, power with others, and power from within. And as we think about this, we have to think about these issues in terms of the positional status, you know, are they obstructive, are they institutional, cultural or structural, power with others, influencing others based upon action on some type of unity. It can be co-powering, collaborative, transcendent, institutional, cultural, and power from within. Expert, ideological, personal, cultural, or transcendent. And so there are three different forms of power that have a role in this discussion. And what is the agenda setting? The context, the process and content, how we stream for change, and how we work with street level bureaucrats, you know, for example, community health workers, and how do we work with those who can implement change because of their congruence with working routines, values, and interests. So power is a very important concern as we talk about pathologies of power. So what do I mean by pathologies of power? I'm talking about privileges and power associated with whiteness. And when I say whiteness, folks, I'm talking about an ideological issue. I'm not talking about a skin color. I'm talking about an ideology and the disadvantages of color. We're talking about the persistence and prevalence of racism and racial prejudice and discrimination. And again, it's important to understand that as we talk about pathologies of power, to understand that is about process and outcome, what those are in this situation and how this relates to health equity. Also, to realize that this notion of pathology of power is rooted in the ideology of inferiority. If somebody is inferior, that means somebody else must be superior. And with that notion of this ideological difference, you have long-term, consistent economic, social, political inequities that are based on the myths and lies of race. The divergent views about the definition of prevalence of these things, particularly since we've seen the advent of SARS-CoV-2, the actual name of this virus, and COVID-19 disease. So we have to think about the microscope that we're under now as we see these inequities exposed under this microscope. But when we look at the literature and culture, we see that non-whites perceive discrimination as institutional in character, and whites see it as discrimination, as a historical legacy of the past or idiosyncratic behavior of an isolated bigot. Primarily, as we talk about implementing health equity in New Mexico and in this country and around the world, we have to give some thought to institutionalized racism. And I say that because I was born during the days of political apartheid and Jim Crow. And I remember as a child being told that I can't sit at this particular counter because I'm a colored person, which it says in my birth certificate that I'm a person of color. And while we've seen individual racism improve somewhat, we have not really addressed institutional racism. So what is institutionalized racism? Again, it's a systemic set of patterns, procedures, practices, and policies within organizations that penalize, disadvantage, and exploit individuals. It also includes organizational procedures, hiring, promotion, and evaluation. It affects recruitment and promotion. And there are three different levels of institutionalized racism. At the individual level, where we talk about staff, member attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, which we see lots of people now talking about implicit bias training, okay? To do with staff member attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Then there's also the internal climate, the inter-organizational issues, which have as a reference point, P&Ps, policies and procedures. What are the policies and procedures that exist within an organization that may seem to be unfair? And then the third characteristic is the extra-organizational, how an institution influences communities, public policies, and institutions through regulatory issues, economic, political, professional shapes. What is the social, political, and economic context of those policies, and procedures, and functionings? Another way of looking at this is just calling it administrative evil. So, power, place, people, where are we? If you take a look at this mosaic, you'll have to understand the pathologies of power and the place where we are right now. I'll let you just sort of gaze at this for a moment. And as you gaze through each one of these slides, they should evoke, an image in your mind that sparks your metacognition as well as your feelings. because as we think about brain function, the primary functions of the mind is thinking, feeling, and wanting. So I'm going to read the bottom left slide, which is a quote from Martin Luther King before his assassination and his death. And he said, "We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, then the giant triplets of evil, racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." And so the top three slides on this represent that notion of what he was talking about: racism, extreme materialism, and militarism, and how that's had an impact on our society. And I see that the views of our pictures and things may be blocking some of the things from where I was, but I hope you can see the entire slides. In the middle of the slide, you see an impoverished person saying, "I became sick because of my poverty," and another person saying, "Well, I became poor because of my sickness." And we have the quote from Nelson Mandela that says, "Poverty is not an accident. Like slavery and apartheid, it is a man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings." And it's that type of agency that's required for us to actually bring about the benefits of health equity. So where people, place, and power matter. Within the slide, you see the representations of equality. And the tagline from this is that equality does not mean equity. If you look at the slide very carefully, you'll see that people are in different stages of development of their lives in different circumstances. And equality just means sameness, same type of resources. But equality doesn't mean justice. Equity means justice. Those who have the least deserve more in order to reap the benefits of having social inclusion, as well as equity and justice and fairness. The same thing applies when we use the term disparities. Disparities are just differential counts, and that's one of the things that we know more about. We seem to collect more data on disparities in this country, so we know that there are differences, but we should be talking about equity and inequities, because when we talk about inequity and equity, we're talking about applying a sense of justice as a corrective measure for making a difference. And what are the resources, what are the fair resources, or application of those resources to give people the optimum circumstances they need in order to survive. So where people, place, and power matter. So let's say a little bit about public health practice and epidemiology. As you can see here, this is, and some folks are trying to change this model now. To the left of the screen, you see the three core functions of public health, which those three core functions are assessment, policy development, and assurance. And inside of the circle, you see the 10 elements of public health services: monitoring, diagnosing, and investigating, informing, educating, empowering, mobilizing community partnerships, developing policies, enforcing laws, linking to provisions, providers of care, assuring competent workforce and evaluation, and research in the center. And those are the essential elements of public health practice. Now, under this, as we talk about social determinants of health or infectious diseases, the notion that comes out of these three core functions and 10 essential services are surveillance, the collection, analysis, and interpretation and dissemination of that data, and how that leads to public health action: priority setting, planning, implementing, and evaluating disease, investigation, control, and prevention. And I should mention with the slide, the takeaway message from this is that public health surveillance is not the same as medical surveillance. Public health surveillance is monitoring health events in populations. Medical surveillance, again, is monitoring potentially exposed individuals to detect early symptoms. And to tell you the truth, most medical surveillance takes place in hospitals and doctor offices. Public health surveillance is about the larger issue in terms of communities and the population. The thing is jumping. Ooh, why is it jumping? You go maybe backtrack a little. Okay. This slide basically just represents, the primary prevention issues, the secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention at the different levels, and what that means in terms of initiating, the process itself to understand the cause of the disease, and understanding if it becomes irreversible or not. Then the clinical detection of the disease and onset of signs and symptoms, and then the outcomes, the expression of that, how we can make substantive changes in health status of disease. Again, from another way of looking at this, from the perspective of health promotion, protection, disease prevention, and control, you see that primary prevention is about looking at individuals in the population who may be susceptible. And we do that because we want to reduce the number of new cases. Secondary prevention is where we look at people who are asymptomatic, and we want to reduce that background prevalence of the consequence of that disease and keep it from spreading. And tertiary prevention is actually working with symptomatic people who have a single illness or multiple illnesses or coexisting illnesses, and how do we reduce the complications and the disability that's associated with those symptomatic illnesses. And as you've probably heard, right now within America's populations of color, we're really finding out that this virus right now is having a huge impact on those who are symptomatic, who have pre-existing conditions. And tell you the truth, within our healthcare budget in this country, which is close to $3 trillion a year, 95% of that healthcare dollar is spent on tertiary issues, treating and working with symptomatic issues or reducing complications and disabilities. And 5 to 10% is somewhere between primary and secondary prevention, when we know that most of the things are 100% preventable. One of the reasons why I wanted to go through this is because sometimes public health folks in the training is still rooted in biological determinism versus chronic stressors. And by that, if you look at the chart here, and let me get my laser pointer going again. As you look at the cellular and molecular, this is where a great deal of our money is spent in these three columns, looking at organ systems, cellular and molecular issues related to the pathology of disease. We know far more about disease processes than we do about actually curing things. We know more about the science of disease than we knew about curing. And at some point, what I'm arguing for is that we have to move to this issue of the chronic stressors. And this is where we get into the issues of social epidemiology by understanding behavioral, psychological issues in terms of what you see listed in the column here, and the social environmental issues in terms of stressful life events, social support, social cultural groupings, family environment, environmental stimulation, enrichment, and environmental hazards. So let's talk about this pathologies of power and oppression, and how pathologies of power and oppression yield structural violence. So we start off with this notion of supremacist ideology, this belief that someone is superior, so someone else must be inferior, and therefore there's a need to be subordinated and to control their lives. So what we see with race and racism and racialization, we see 500 years of whiteness and the colonization of this issue. And I have race in quotation marks because with our work with the Institute of Race and Social Justice on main campus at UNM, we've decided that we want people to understand that race is a myth, but racism is reality. And race primarily is a social and political economic construct, but not a biological one. And so this notion of this supremacist ideology leads to discriminatory acts, which leads to cultural and historical trauma, disparities and inequities. And it also leads to structural dominance in terms of power and place, in terms of whiteness as property, possessive investment, privilege, performance, terror, supremacy, social systems, and the triplets of evil, as Martin Luther King once outlined in terms of racialization, materialism, and militarism. And that structural dominance leads to oppression. And when I say oppression, I'm talking about ageism, genderism, sexism, ableism, language issues, disability, racism. Those are all forms of oppression. And they lead to 5 forms of injustices: distributive injustice, procedural injustice, retributive injustice, moral exclusion, and cultural imperialism. And so with distributive justice, we're talking about, how resources are allocated or not. With procedural injustice, we're talking about, substantive and procedural issues that determine what rules are made to govern those things. Retributive justice is about punishment. Plain and simple. We believe more in punishment in this country than we do about restorative justice. And then moral exclusion, and cultural imperialism are other factors that fall under injustices under oppression. So what are the alert signs of structural violence? Disease outbreaks, poverty line indicators, basic needs index, unemployment, youth without jobs, food shortages, famine, food deserts, violence, oppression, political instability, corruption, disintegration of government and institutions, and migration of people. People migrate and move because they're trying to find some optimal way of surviving amidst all the madness throughout the structural violence. What are the effects of structural violence and racism and health status? They can be direct or indirect. And as we talk about the life course trajectory, there can be 3 pathways. Latent, early life environments affect adult health independent of intervening experience. Pathway, early life environment sets individuals onto the life course trajectories that affect health status over time. And cumulative, the intensity and duration of that exposure to unfavorable environments and how that adversely affects health status, the dose response effect. Indirect can be the material interpretation of the psychosocial interpretation, but there is a graded relationship between socioeconomic position and access to tangible goods and services, particularly public goods by race. For example, why is it we have to pay for bottled water when water is a public good that should be shared for everyone? Next, we'll be buying air, which, if I recall properly, I remember a few years ago, there were air bars where people could go and breathe in oxygen, in order to, try to cure, certain ailments and things. The psychosocial interpretation can be direct and indirect effects of stress from being either lower on the socioeconomic hierarchy or living under those conditions of relative, disadvantage. So again, look at this, look at the two trees that I have here. And you see, again, how our environments cultivate our communities and our communities nurture our health. And on, with the tree diagram on the left of my screen, if you see it that way, you see one tree is obviously thriving and the other one isn't. The tree that's not thriving, the roots of that tree are being fed on adverse living conditions, poverty, segregation, poor quality schools, marketing of tobacco and alcohol, unemployment, underemployment, environmental toxins, discrimination, institutionalized racism, occupational hazards, and poor quality schools. And those phenomena have a direct impact on the growth of the trunk of that tree, which results in fragmented systems, restrictions on power, disinvestment in communities, and disconnected members. And the stresses from those feeds into the chronic diseases that we see there. So when inequities are high and community assets are low, health outcomes are the worst. But if we move to the tree that's flourishing, if we look at the roots of that tree and why it's thriving because there are quality schools, access to healthy foods, access to healthcare, access to recreational facilities, adequate incomes, living wages, health insurance, clean environments, quality housing, jobs, living wages, transportation resources, access to healthcare. And the branch, the trunk of that tree has means the community has great organizational networks, political influence, leadership, participation, social support, social networks, and a sense of community. And those chronic diseases are minimized. So again, when health inequities are low and community access are high, health outcomes are the worst. So now let's talk about structural violence. As we talk about structural violence, we have to talk about disparities, disabilities, and deaths that result when systems, institutions, policies, or cultural beliefs meet some people's human needs and human rights at the expense of others. Structural violence creates relationships that cause secondary violence to occur. And we never talk about structural violence in this country. We always talk about secondary violence, for the most part, either as self-destruction, community destruction, or international destruction. And as you see, self-destruction is about alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, depression, internalized depression, community destruction, crime, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, rape. And at the national level and international level, you see rebel movements, terrorism, suicide, civil wars, revolutions, coups, and wars. And we have to understand that secondary violence are reactions and responses to structural violence. We really need to start looking at the roots of this and dealing with the causes and not just the effects. Now, problematically, when we talk about the structural violence and we look at this through the lens of social epidemiology, we'll see the notion of embodiment in health inequities and health inequalities. Bodies tell stories about human beings that cannot be studied or divorced from the conditions of their existence. Bodies tell stories that often but not always match people's stated accounts. And bodies tell stories that people either cannot or will not tell, either because they are unable, forbidden, or choose not to tell. So within clinical care, we always ask people, what's wrong with you? We never say, what's happened to you, to try to understand what is actually happening in their lives and what is their background in terms of those social toxins in the environment. So it is a truism. Population health is shaped by social and biological processes. There's a contrast between biological determinism, that says that you're determined things happen to you because your biology is defective, and the biological expressions of inequality. Discrimination, which is a process, it maintains privilege and subordination. And we have to, when we look at discrimination, that process, we have to think about the aspects, the type, the form, the agency, the expression, the domain and the level, the cumulative exposure, the timing, whether it's intrauteral, infancy, childhood, adolescence, adult, the life course trajectory. And most diseases start, at the intrauteral level or the infancy level. The intensity, from mild to severe, the frequency, is it chronic, acute, sporadic, and the duration, the time span over the time. And with that last checkpoint there, you see all the other issues that have an impact in understanding these social and biological processes in terms of gender, sexism, and sex, human rights and social justice, the life course perspective, all these things, social class, SES, social determinants of health, social production of scientific knowledge, stress, or the structural, interpersonal, behavioral, or cognitive, the role of human agency is determined by theories of disease distribution. All these things have an impact on how we use social epidemiology and not just the old model of epidemiology that treats people primarily from the biological perspective and overlooks the social and psychological issues. So learning objective number 2, what are the merits of risk versus promotion? And in fact, what are the stigmas that occurred to people when we don't observe the issues of using social epidemiology and understanding power and privilege? As we talk about social epidemiology and the embodiment and the geographic study of life and death, you see that social determinants of health are basically about where you live, work, and play, and go to school, and how that has impact on your life. And many of you probably heard that, what we've learned from social determinants of health and social epidemiology, that where you live, work, play, and go to school is more important than your genetic code. So this is more than looking at the individual lifestyle factors of age, sex, and heredity factors, but looking at the issues of the social and community networks and the general social, economic, cultural, and environmental conditions in terms of agriculture and food production, education, the work environment, unemployment, water and sanitation, healthcare services, and housing. This is how we achieve health equity, by working on those issues, working upstream. The eco-social model, I put this here because Donna Bedian, who talked about a structured process model, is a framework for understanding health services and outcomes. So when we talk about an eco-social model, we're talking about structure and process and outcomes. Structure refers to the physical and organizational properties of a setting in which care is provided. The process is the treatment or service being provided to a patient, and outcomes are the results of that treatment or service. So again, this is more than just looking at individual knowledge about attitudes and beliefs, or the interpersonal issues of family, provider, peers, and social networks, but really how we begin to understand the organization of the community and the policy issues. The state and local health departments, the employee work sites, health insurance plans, public and private, healthcare systems, academic medical institutions, tribal or urban health clinics, professional organizations, community-based organizations. This is where, we have to apply our knowledge about how we undo institutionalized racism and how it has an impact on the communities. And as we go further upstream, how do we look at policies at the local, state, and national legislatures? How we look at federal government agencies and issues regarding national advocacy and nonprofit organizations. Now, downstream, upstream interventions. If you look at this graph, you'll see that, again, in the far right-hand corner of this histogram, you see that clinical care basically just focuses on individuals, and it's a good thing. But as you look at how health outcomes are improved, you see that it's tremendously improved when we understand how we work with health promotion and prevention at the community level and at the societal and institutional level, and how public advocacy, health promotion and prevention, and intersectoral issues in terms of working, jobs, and housing and education increase exponentially. Health outcomes improve when we move further up that level. But again, most of our concentration seems to be at the individual and the clinical care issue. And we all know that in America, most of our work, our conversations in America, not about families and communities. It's always about the individual. And that's something that we have to, disconnect. So we really need to start moving upstream and looking at the policies and procedures that exist, which are right or wrong or ineffective, or what new ones need to take in place. And that's important for, why voting is important in a true democratic republic. This is just a model saying the same thing, but it's about clinical and prevention services. And again, you see the types of interventions and services on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, you see primary care offices, health system, community-based organizations, the built environment of works and schools, community, states, and nations. And once again, when we move from screening tests to preventive medications to behavior change and counseling to information education, organizational policies, and public policies, the issues are increased tremendously when we move along that spiral, along that trajectory to working further upstream. And there are great stories about that I can relate. This is just, I'm going to just go with quickly, and these slides will be made available to you folks later also too, the population health key elements, and how the things highlighted in red represent population health key elements in terms of measuring population health status, analyzing determinants of health, basing decisions on evidence, health systems, determinations, interventions, increasing upstream investments, which I was just talking about, multiple strategies, public involvement, intersectoral collaborations, and accountability with the goals of improving health of a population and increasing health status inequities. And so the blocks, which are solid blocks, are the generic process steps. I think this is an important thing to understand about social determinants of health. There's a linear relationship between education and health. And as we talk about, everyone now is talking about early childhood brain development and ACE, adverse child experiences, what that means for the life course trajectory and importance of giving people the health of the educated. We'll see that if we're bringing up children in socially toxic environments, that's going to have an impact on the academic performance. That's going to also, which is going to transform into having a negative impact on educational attainment and what that means for adult health status. So education is the strongest and the most robust predictor of health and education and well-being. But in this country, we tend to think about education as being primarily about the accumulation of wealth. So under this, this crisis right now, we can just look back at what's happening with our schools being shut down and what the digital divide means for students who don't have access to computers or information technology. This is just about the relationship between health education and health promotion, and how the environment is so important in terms of how we understand the social, the economic, the political, the policy issues, the regulatory, and the organizational issues. And I say this because I think at some point we have to stop talking about people who are at risk and creating stigmas. People are doing some things which are solid interventions for improving their health and status and well-being, but we need to give them more opportunities to have that optimum opportunities increase. So we need to do that through health education and health promotion, and not just say they have a risk factor, but what are the promotion factors? What are the protective factors that they have? And what are the things they need that continue to help them protect their health and well-being of their lives in the communities? So learning objective number 3, we're going to review and analyze the impact of emerging infectious diseases, EID, such as SARS-CoV-2, which is the actual name of this virus. This is SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, the disease process, and what that means for health equity. So as we look at the Anthropocene right now, and we talk about human security, societal stability, climate systems, and natural resources, we'll see that we have tremendous human vulnerabilities, conflict sensitivities, climate sensitivities, and environmental vulnerabilities. And over the last 500 years, we see that, these issues of public goods in terms of water, food, energy, health, income, livelihood, sensitivities in terms of political events, migration, violence, conflict, climate sensitivities in terms of extreme weather, ocean current, sea levels issues, the natural resources, are all adversely affected by what's happened over the last 500 years of history. And there are several factors that influence that, so we need to have more adaptive capacities for major emergency responses, and understand that public health no longer refers only to medical care, but more accurately reflects governance, transportation, communication, public safety, the judiciary, and other civil sectors. But nobody cares about public health until there's a natural or human-generated disaster that occurs. So again, I'm going to skate over this for a moment, but I just wanted, as we're talking about emerging infectious diseases, what happened with Ebola a few years ago is very similar to what's happening now, and how we see that bats are strongly implicated as both reservoirs and hosts for that virus, which out of the 5 Ebola viruses, subtypes, 4 are capable of human-to-human transmission. And response that came place for dealing with this particular disaster was well intended and well matched, but that has not happened with the present emerging infectious diseases, which is such as SARS. But the factors, for emerging infectious diseases, and these are borderless impacts, are human demographics and behavior, technology and industry, economic development and land use, international travel and commerce, microbial adaptation and culture and change, and breakdown of public health measures, and when the paucity of public health measures we have in place are broken down and not been supported, that increases, dare I say, the probabilities right now, the risk of something going wrong as it does. So I think the take-home message from this is that as you look at this notion of emerging infectious diseases, understand zoonosis, which is what SARS is, it's a complex disease problem that can't be solved without partnering with professionals from different disciplines to identify these interrelated human, animal, and environmental risk factors. But 60% of all infectious diseases are caused by zoonosis. So when we look at the interactions between livestock, wildlife, and humans, we'll see that we have exposure of Lyme disease, monkeypox, hantaviruses, Ebola, SARS, rabies, West Nile virus, tuberculosis, anthrax, tularemia, plague, brucellosis, E. coli, cowpox, Rift Valley fever. Again, it all transmitted to humans. So we have to really think about these interactions between livestock and wildlife, and how that interacts with the factors that I've described for emerging infectious diseases. Now, with COVID-19 or SARS for 2.0, problematically, there's something called the R0 scale. And with this COVID infection, you see that if one person is infected, they can pass this on to at least 2.5 other people. Ebola, if one person is affected, they can affect anywhere between 1.6 to 2 people. With H1N1, the flu, one person can infect anywhere from 1 to 1.5 people. MERS and SARS, SARS basically, SARS 1.0, one person can infect 2 to 4 people, and MERS can infect 2.5 to 7 people. Fortunately, we don't see much of that, of MERS right now. But this is just to show you just how serious this situation is. and how it affects the lungs and causes so many different types of issues because of the immune response that takes place in the body with the cytokine burst and the invasion that takes place, which can run anywhere from mild to severe. Right now, I just want to say this is what's happening at the cellular level, the iceberg effect of COVID-19 or SARS. At the host response to the right of this pyramid, you'll see that as we talk about symptomatics and asymptomatics, with the solid line going through this pyramid on the right-hand side, you see the arrows going upwards and downwards representing subclinical disease. And you can have people who are exposed without infection, and you have some people who have infection without clinical illness. And depending on, the resources that they have in their communities, they could be infected without clinical illness and still infect others, but it could lead to clinical disease that could lead to moderate severity of mild illness, clinical and severe disease, and sometimes fatalities on the human host side. At the cellular level, you see that things happen below that solid line, which is below the visual change: exposure without cell entry, incomplete viral maturation, and then discernible effects in terms of cell transformation or cell dysfunction, and the death of that cell and the cellular response, and where transplant stays. So that's pretty much the physiology of what's happening. And in most cases, what we are seeing right now are those issues of clinical disease and discernible effect. But we do have many people who are trying to understand what's happening at the subclinical level of the visual change. And I have another slide later that I'm going to relate to this that talks about, the issues that's below the visible level that we have to deal with. But the take-home message is social toxicity gets under the skin. And when we have a toxic environment, it affects the physical and social and the cultural issues. And depending on the intervening variables that people have at their disposal, it has impact on the nervous system. And that response, the exposure to that gives off, sort of corresponds with whatever intervening variables they may have for support and resiliency. And it can lead to psychiatric illness or physical illness. So trauma and social location. We're learning now, to see this in terms of what happens to children who are very vulnerable. And right now, what we're seeing is that we thought at first that SARS was not only having an impact only on older adults. We're seeing it at the middle-age groups too now, but we're seeing now how this exposure is having impact on children also too. And it's very similar to something that I worked on years before moving to New Mexico. I was trained in the work of Kawasaki syndrome by one of the first founders of this illness in America. And for 3 years, it was my research project working on Kawasaki syndrome. And we're seeing similar illnesses like that in children now. But as you can see, from conception to death, with early adverse childhood experiences with children and exposure, there's an impact on the social, cognitive, and social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors as they become older. You have disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. And so, as we talk about the microaggressions and implicit bias and epigenetics, we have to talk about trauma and social location that exists within our communities. And what are those generational embodiment issues, the social context, the complex trauma, issues of allostatic load, the weathering hypothesis, coping, the burden of diseases, and early death. And these are things that people are just hinting at when we talk about coexisting conditions. But from what we know about social determinants of health, one zip code heavily impacts baseline external stressors. And awareness of this concept allows for a paradigm shift to go to asking what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. So chronic stress and life events, again, the stressor, the uncertainty, the fear, the anxiety, and then there's appraisal of the exposure and personal factors. And if people have the resources, then there's eustress, there's good stress, which we see, in every day of our lives. Eustress is a good thing. But distress and the stress response is what's really problematic. And with distress and the stress response, we have coping and intrusive thoughts that lead to, smoking, alcohol abuse, diet, improper diets, inadequate diets, substance abuse, physical inactivity, adherence and compliance to medical treatments, the physiological effects in terms of immunocompetence, immunosuppression, immunodeficiency, and on the far side of things, suicide, homicide, and genocide. So chronic stressors and the life events are intimately tied in with this. And again, as we talk about the weathering hypothesis and the disease burden, people have comorbidities or coexisting conditions, which in some cases, Blackness may be a pre-existing condition in this country, and how the chronic stresses of dealing with, institutionalized racism, personal racism, it has an impact, eventually that happens to the brain, the heart, the blood, the kidney, the muscle, the liver, the lungs, become impacted. And again, the issues of what happens to the immune functions that take place in terms of how the body recognizes self from non-self. We've been hearing a lot about flattening the curve. Mitigation efforts can help reduce the number of daily cases and reduce the burden on the healthcare system. But what I really want to refer to now is that, and I'm going to move past this notion of types of immunity right now, but I want to say that our watchword right now should be more than just about flattening the curve from an infectious disease, but how #equity flattens the curve. Again, let me repeat that. #equity flattens the curve. When we focus on the social determinants of health. So in this diagram here, you see I have an impoverished person who's complaining to a healthcare provider. And after he registers his complaint, that provider says, well, you're coughing, and I would prescribe a syrup for your cough. But meanwhile, that person continues to breathe in the toxic smoke from poverty, injustice, caste systems, the lack of facilities, myths, exploitation. And so what I want to say is that people need protection from negative social determinants. And when we think about these social determinants, we need to think about the negative social determinants and how we develop a new herd immunity. And Williamson Cooper in 2020 just published a new article on this, talking about this notion of negative social determinants and developing a new herd immunity. And I'm tying that into how medicine alone cannot deal with the many factors that cause ill health. So health equity can build a new herd immunity by dealing with how we reduce racial and ethnic inequities and what are the efforts that are necessary to address the social determinants of health. And a new herd immunity in that sense can be like a vaccine, analogous to a vaccine that improves population health and creates this herd immunity against those inequities. But most importantly, I think the thing that I want to deal with this right now is that how do we close the empathy gap, and how the empathy gap matters profoundly because empathy predicts policy preferences to address the needs of disadvantaged populations. Let me say that again. If we're going to go by the hashtag equity flattens the curve, then we have to reduce the empathy gap that predicts the policy preferences to address the needs of the disadvantaged populations. So equity flattens the curve. We have to think about, in the case of African Americans who are like the canary in the coal mine, the issues of historical and cultural trauma, the slave health deficit, issues of negrophobia, anti-Blackness, pigmentocracy, and other issues, and identity due to dislocation, the internalized oppression that people of color sometimes deal with, pathologies of power and structural violence, the stigmas and institutionalized behaviors, post-traumatic slave dysfunction deficit, the types of racism-related stressors, life events which are time-limited, vicarious experiences, observations, and shared reports of others, living through others, the daily micro-stressors, the chronic contextual issues, the institutional and systemic ones, the transgenerational or historical effects, and social class. I'm going to skip over this notion right now of non-specific responses, adaptive responses of cellular immunity and antibody-related immunity. We'll come back to that later. Learning objective number 4, analyzing the merits of critical legal studies and its use in transforming public health systems and services and public health law research for improvements in a culture of health equity. And that's what we need, a culture of health equity. And that gets back to the statement I meant about, well, how do we improve closing the gap for having more empathy about those who have little? So let's talk about the root cause analysis squared, as I put it, the root cause analysis squared of institutionalized racism. And I call it root cause analysis squared because it's just not about the analysis, but it's about action, okay? So when we talk about root causes and action for dealing with institutionalized racism, we have to talk about the structural violence and pre-existing conditions under the social determinants of health. And so when we look at root cause analysis, this is about, moving from beyond just the symptom of the problem, the weed, above the surface issues, which is very obvious. And cognitive studies, and behavior show that most people have been trained to think about, let's look at surface similarities. Let's just look at the surface, what's on the obvious. And they refuse to go below the surface to look at the root, what's not so obvious. And I think we'll have, more in terms of prevention. If we can eradicate the root causes of so much of this, we can do much better in terms of developing health equity. So I saw a student give a presentation for community engagement, and I thought I have to borrow this slide because this is perfect for dealing with the issues that, what people see on the surface. And so when we talk about overt white supremacy, people just see the surface of this, and they just see the issues that are related to lynching, hate crimes, swastikas, KKK, the N-word, racial slurs, racist jokes, burning crosses, neo-Nazis. That's the overt white supremacy that's related to, the ideological conditions of supremacist ideology that I'm superior, so someone else must be inferior. Well, we never look at the covert white supremacy issues, which are socially acceptable. Again, socially acceptable, but people are talking about it now more, but it hasn't become unacceptable yet. Making America great again, hiring discrimination, police murdering people of color, discriminatory lending, Confederate flags, school to prison pipelines, not believing the experiences of people of color, the virtuous victim narrative, denial of white privilege, denial of racism, but what about me, blaming the victims, tokenism, the white savior complex, colorblindness, English-only initiatives, Eurocentric curriculums, police brutality, mass incarceration, paternalism, anti-immigration policies and practices, housing discrimination, fearing people of color, particularly now since people of color wearing masks, believing we are post-racial, racial mascots. It's just a joke, claiming reverse racism, not challenging racist jokes, cultural appropriation, the bootstrap theory. Don't blame me, I never owned slaves. The self-appointed white allies, assuming that good intentions are enough. We have to move beyond these socially acceptable microaggressions and move to making it socially unacceptable. So we have social cohesion. So how, to give you a further clue about just where America is right now in terms of institutionalized racism, I used this in one of my classes once before, and look at the history of this. As we look at the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution of 1787, 1791, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, 3/5 compromise. People of African descent were considered 3/5 of a person for the purposes of voting rights. People of color were outnumbering the colonists, and so they couldn't, they were not allowed to vote and participate. So this clause was put into the Constitution. And if you look at the statistics and data today, from 1791 to the present, Black folks, you could say that maybe not so much 3/5 of a person, but maybe now 76% of a person. The Naturalization Act of 1790, only free white persons are permitted to become naturalized citizens, which opened the door to European immigrants, but not others. Only male citizens can vote, serve on juries, hold office, or hold property. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 enforces Article 4, Section 2, the Constitution, requiring the return of runaway slaves to their masters. Black Codes, 1804 to 1865, the Deep South and South border states, restrictions on civil rights and liberties. The Indian Relocation Act of 1830, forced relocation of Cherokee, Creeks, and other Eastern Indians west of the Mississippi to make room for white settlers. The Fugitive Slave Act law of 1850, the law enforcement officials everywhere were required to arrest people suspected of being a runaway slave, the kidnapping and conscription of free blacks. And some of this, when I talk about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the 1793, these are the precursors, really, of the prison industrial complex. The Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott versus Sanford, a Negro, free or otherwise, cannot have U.S. citizenships. We're still having these conversations in America today about who is a citizen, who's not a citizen. The Homestead Act of 1862, that converted 270 million acres of native land to white settlers. The Northern Apprenticeship laws, self-sufficiency discouraged. The slaughterhouse cases of 1873, where the privileges and immunities clauses were applied to national citizenship for corporations and gave corporations dual citizenship, under the rights of the 13th and 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court decisions overturning Reconstruction of 1877, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Geary Act of 1892 related to that, Jim Crow laws of 1890 to 1965, the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, Racial Integrity Acts of 1924 to 1967, and other acts such as the Federal Housing Authority Act from 1934 to 62, the Social Security Act, and Wagner Acts, and there are more. This shows you just how ingrained this is in policies and procedures and why we need to correct that. Now, again, the context, for understanding institutionalized racism and inequities is understand the context of the dominant consensus on race and what that means in terms of white privileges, national values, contemporary culture, the current manifestations, the social and institutional dynamics, the processes that maintain those racial hierarchies that keeps equity out of sight, racialized public places and institutional practices and the outcomes, racialized inequities and current levels of well-being, and diminished capacity for individuals and communities, to have improvement. To the right of this, the verbiage basically, if you haven't seen or understand Noam Chomsky, you have to review his, if not the book, but review his film, The American Nightmare, Requiem for an American Dream, which I called American Nightmare, as Malcolm X called it. But he talked in that, he discusses, the 30 or more issues that have taken place to transform American culture over the last 30 years. But within that, of whiteness, you see the issues of poverty, possessive investment, privilege, performance, terror, privilege supremacy, racialized social systems, and the shock doctrine written by Naomi Klein that talks about the creation of creating risk in populations to bring about, change after people are disoriented and excessively distracted emotionally and physically, and how that puts corporations and profit and privatization further in power, which increases pathologies of power. And one of the things that, Noam Chomsky talked about in terms of this pathologies of power reductions in democracy, reshaping ideologies, redesigning the economy, shifting tax burdens to those who can least afford it, attacks on solidarity and unions, control run of regulators, reducing regulatory issues that keep our environment safe, engineering elections, keeping unions in line, manufacturing consent through the media, and marginalization of populations. It's all there. So if we're going to do institutionalized racism and come forth to address health equity, we have to remember that oppression permeates all different types of organizational characteristics and dimensions and systems, and how we need to look at systems and organizational theory and how that interacts. So, again, I mentioned the 3 levels: the individual level, the staff members' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors; the inter-organizational level, operations, so internal climate, the issues that staff relationships rooted in hierarchical power relationships, decreases in psychological empowerment and promotes powerlessness and among staff and clients, and an extra-organizational level as an instrument of domination, and how it limits viability and sustainability of organizations and communities to serve, because they're being that access to resources being controlled. And so I think we really have to understand how we come about with organizational theories to dismantle this administrative evil. Again, emerging issues, the phenomenon of structural racism. Again, folks that exist, the historiography of racism in U.S. higher education and educational apartheid. Right now, you see hundreds of thousands of books questioning affirmative action and anti-discrimination laws, the questioning of the intelligence of people of color, increasing racial rhetoric of some white politicians and talk show hosts, multiplication of white supremacy organizations, bureaucratic impersonality, discrimination of tokenism against faculty of color in curriculums, destruction of American liberal arts curriculum, regression of American scholarship, and liberal arts, and again, the increase of supremacist ideology and global education. Similarity and differences. One size does not fit all. If you're talking about, reducing prejudice, reduction, eliminating racism, you can see that this chart deals with the levels of analysis and intended outcomes, which are personal awareness and healing. Healing and reconciliation deals with individual transformation, intergroup, racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. Anti-racism deals with structural, systemic oppression in institutions, policies, and practices, which deals with social change and social transformation. Diversity and multiculturalism, which deals with individuals and intergroup issues, which is about tolerance, awareness of cultural differences. And then democracy building, which deals with intergroup issues of analysis and engaged citizenry. And one size doesn't fit all, but we need to figure out what strategies are most appropriate for the resource you have for tackling, taking on and undoing oppression in all of its, hatred forms, hideous forms. My work in public health is basically a mixture of critical public health critical race praxis and anti-racism. And at the core of this is how we deal with racialization, racial phenomenon, race and ethnicity, and racism, and how we look at this through the lens of social epidemiology, also too, in terms of social location, an individual's group or position in society within that hierarchy, privileged versus marginalized, minority versus majority, understanding how to eliminate racial inequities, and theories of experiential knowledge, whether tacit or implicit knowledge, science and action, in the process, contemporary patterns of racial relations, issues of producing new knowledge and identifying norms and other concerns, and how that's operationalized and what those actions are, and the 10 principles, race consciousness, a deep awareness of position, the primacy of racialization that exists, significance of social political history, and how it's embedded in society, the structural determinism, power and existence across place and time, the social construction of knowledge, reevaluation of disciplines through anti-racism lens, critical approaches, how we dig below the surface to uncover our own biases as well, intersectionality, how we interlock, the nature of co-occurring categories, a disciplinary self-critique, systematic examination of disciplinary conventions and broader impact on society, and voice, understanding, how we have to prioritize the perspectives of marginalized people and their experiential knowledge of, from the mainstreams, and how that has to be respected. My research also includes a lot of work now in what's called mind, brain, and education sciences, and how I look at the intersections of neurosciences and brain and functionings, pedagogy, individual education and learning, and psychology, and issues of neuroplasticity and functions of the minds in terms of thinking, acting, and wanting, and how we move people from the lowest level of functions, of the medulla oblongata, the brainstem, to get people to move towards the most complex issues of the prefrontal area where problem solving, cognition, and thinking and learning and language takes place. Now I mentioned this notion about empathy for social justice and equity. And the important thing to remember here is that when we look at this model of the brain, as we talk about what I have here in the red box highlighted, I have the hippocampus where learning and memory takes place, and the thalamus and the amygdala. And two things I want to say about the things of the amygdala, and hippocampus is that when children in particularly are under a great deal of toxic environmental stress that they carry with them to adulthood, the hippocampus shrinks in function. So learning and memory are lessened because of that toxic stress, because of the buildup of cortisol and epinephrine and other things that take place. The amygdala, that I want to get to as part of the limbic system is deals with issues of attachment, sexual behavior, emotional reactivity, and motor regulation. And that is that emotional reactivity and the feelings, that interaction that I want to deal with, because, people who don't understand social justice, something is wrong with their amygdala. And it's been hijacked, and what's happening is that when it's hijacked like that, there's a loss of intellectual empathy for social justice. And studies have shown that when you lose your empathy for the suffering of other people, you become a sociopath in nature. Again, when you lose your intellectual empathy for the suffering of other people, you become a sociopath. And so the amygdala is a storehouse of emotional memories. It's responsible for survival instincts, fight or flight. It results, in different anxiety disorders, which we're seeing a great deal of in terms of public health and neuroses that's happening for a number of different reasons. And the signs, and you see this in terms of the strong emotional reactions that's happening within society, the sudden onset of issues. And, we have to understand if that post-episodic realization, if that reaction was inappropriate. The thalamus in that area, that part of the brain overrides the cortex when external stimuli triggers enough capacity. And the brain decides to send data from that stimulus to the limbic of the cortex. And low to moderate stress levels, affect the prefrontal cortex, which send messages of pro and con reactions. Now, the thing I put a note here for myself about the three characteristics of whiteness, and the studies that I've looked at say that the three characters of whiteness are one, that people who adopt the supremacy attitude basically negate democracy. Their own intellectual growth is stunted. Okay, and when their own intellectual growth is stunted, they just you have these reactions. And oh my gosh, all of a sudden I'm tongue-tied and I can't remember the third one I want to use, but I'll come back to it in a moment. So stunting of growth, intellectual, stunting, negation of democracy, and the third one will come to me in a moment. Okay, so we need to, improve the life course trajectory. We need to bring about more effective public health services and systems through academia, which means we've got to, disembark or disengage institutionalized racism in terms of organizational structures, the finance, the technology development and methods, and what that means for workforce development. One thing I want to say about PPACA, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And most of this conversation in this country has been about the insurance aspect of this in terms of healthcare access. But if you read that act very carefully, there are provisions, which I believe in Title VI, that talks about monies are available for prevention in terms of to increase public health workforce, strengthen quality management, loan repayment programs for people who are working in public health, workforce grants for state and local programs, public health fellowships and preventive medicine training grants, and reauthorization of public health workforce programs. We need to start accessing that and making that work at the state and local level. In terms of one of my other ideas for work in forensic epidemiology is understanding how to better use public health law. And my models for that are really these two gentlemen that you see, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. And I put these two men here. Both were lawyers, and they both worked for the NAACP. Charles Hamilton Houston on the left was Thurgood Marshall's teacher in law school. And he had a statement that said, Charles Hamilton Houston said at that time, that a lawyer who isn't working for social justice is a parasite on society. And I thought, wow, that's pretty strong. But he led the charge for the NAACP to use public health law to bring Brown versus Board of Education to the Supreme Court. And I think as we talk about health equity, that same model can be followed in terms of public health law, which would lead to better health faster for all by using public health law to improve access to evidence and expertise in designing legal solutions, helping communities engage in building political will, support for enforcing and defending legal solutions, and political and policy surveillance and evaluation. So, this can be transdisciplinary, in terms of building a culture of health by looking at public health law interventions, laws that influence outcomes of mediators, infrastructure, laws that establish the powers, duties, and structures of public health agencies, which have been eroded before this SARS 2.0 really had an impact on our country and other places in the United States. Incidental public health law, laws that regardless of topic or purpose, that are studied for the impact on public health law. And I say this because when I was getting my training in public health, my dean, who was an assistant surgeon general, the youngest ever in the United States, he told us, I don't care what you learn about epidemiology, biostatistics, behavioral health, environmental health. Never forget, this is all, public health is all politics. And it's all about, within that political definition about who gets what, when, how, where, and why. And I'm kind of a political junkie, so I understand that notion about working with policies and procedures and how we move forward with that. This is just a map showing the influence of public health law research. The inputs, the lawmaking, interventional, infrastructural, incidental, the mediators, what are the legal practices, C and D, that lead to changes in behavior and changes in policy outputs in terms of population health. So I'm trying to spend more time working on those issues. So my last objective, learning objective number 5, explain and support progressive obligations for health equity, the human rights issue. Folks, unashamedly, unabashedly, I'm a supporter of the United Nations Declaration, Articles 25 and 26, that say that health is a human right and education is a human right. So when we have to look at human suffering under structural violence, we have to look at poorly designed policies that yield inadequate food, housing, health, safe and just working conditions, education, economic security, clothing, and family relationships, and understand that people live a life of oppression, exclusion, exploitation, marginalization, and collective humiliation and stigmatization, as well as repression, inequities, and a lack of opportunities. And it's no fault of their own, per se. What happens? People arm themselves to protect their commodities and access to them. And that leads to overlooking connections between consumerism and oppressive regimes in terms of governments and financial institutions and transnational corporations, and why we see increases in the drug trade, military spending, and human rights violations. And again, the most vulnerable in society, women, children, elders, those from different ethnic, racial, cultural, religious groups, and sexual orientation. I'm going to just glance over this right now because I would just say that nearly, according to a survey from the American Psychological Association, nearly 7 in 10 adults in the US, 69% report discrimination and 61% report experiencing day-to-day discrimination. And again, discrimination is reported across subgroups of adults, including age, race/ethnicity, disability, gender, sex orientation, gender identity. And it's the most common reported experience of major discrimination related to employment. In fact, when I look at an EEO study that was done a few years ago, the number one offender in terms of labor issues and discrimination in employment are healthcare institutions. So that's what led Martin Luther King at one point to say that of all the injustices that exist, injustice in healthcare is probably the most heinous and most disturbing. But this discrimination is shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources through local communities in the nation and the world. And there are other worries and concerns and things also too. So frameworks for equity and justice. We have people who work at the individual level, the institutional level, the community level, and there are different theories for that. Liberalism, the person, well-being, individual freedom, the marketplace, the rule that does everything, the policies, the minimum state, individual rights, and the paradigm, distributive justice. What can I justly claim? At the institutional level, deliberative democracy, public governance, popular sovereignty, responsive states, civic participation, deliberative justice. Who decides and how? And then you have the community issue, humanitarianism. What's the common good? What is social solidarity? What is public welfare in terms of a responsive state, a responsible state? And then social justice, what's good for us? And as you look at these different frameworks for equity and justice, and you look at how SARS 2.0 has affected the world and put the social determinants of health under that microscope, you can see how certain governments, institutions are faring well or not so well, depending on their focus and what their theory and what their policies are with the paradigm that exists. So neoliberalism and health inequities, a brief critique. Again, neoliberal doctrines are either unconcerned with or positively endorse inequities, inequalities. Neoliberalists are particularly individualistic and attacking the various forms of collective or state action, antithetical to social cohesion and social trust. Standards of living are not focused on human well-being, but only on macroeconomic indicators. And just recently, I've just learned that for those of you who are Democrats who support the Democratic Party, and again, these are my concerns, not the concerns of the University of New Mexico or anything else like that. But I just saw a very interesting phenomenon occur that took place between Biden and Sanders. And they've come together with a coalition, and they put together some task force of people that represent some pretty interesting task force that's going to lead to some very, very progressive ideas and things of that nature. And that's a sign for hope. So anybody's interested in it, I'll send you the article that looks at that, because that's an important criteria as we talk about the relationship between economic and the political and the social and health, and what kinds of political and social arrangements are being made. The preamble of the UN, basically, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. And I want to focus on this dignity thing in a moment, because for some reason or another, in this country, in many places, dignity is not equated with a human right. We're still having that discussion. That is dignity a human right or is it not? But how we establish conditions for which justice and respect of those obligations arise from treaties, and basically to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. In many ways, as we talk about dismantling WHO and other international norms, we see that these could be gross injustices, that type of issues, because as it says, we the people of the United Nations, which, remember, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was modeled after the US Constitution. And so for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and ensure by acceptance of principles and the institutions of methods that armed forces will not be used saving the common interest, and deploy international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. So, human rights-based approaches, HBRA, state obligations, respect, protect, and fulfill. The state who signed off on human rights issues basically have to fulfill these obligations, not to interfere with the enjoyment of the rights to health. Prevent parties from interfering with the right to health. Ensure that private companies provide safe environmental conditions for employees and communities, not put regulations that allow them carte blanche. Fulfill, adopt appropriate legislative, administrative, budgetary, judicial, promotion, other measures to fully realize the health. So again, a state is obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill. Fundamental human rights-based approaches, HRBA, in terms of health for all, health and all policies. This is so amazing that in this country now, we're finally starting to talk about health and all policies. Back in the 80s, when I worked overseas with UNICEF and WHO, many countries were adopting this notion of health for all under primary care issues. And it's taken us almost 30 years just to get to this point where to say, oh, health for all is a good thing to happen. And you see it disguised as universal care and other types of things. But the conditions and resources for health rights-based approaches for true health promotion, disease prevention, you see to the left of this, the conditions and resources. Peace is listed first on this list. Not shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity, but peace. And I say that because, you know, peace is the antithesis of violence. And as we talk about structural violence, you know, you cannot have peace. Peace is hard to define, but we know it by its absence. So we know that we're dealing with structural violence. And so with health promotion improvements, we have to talk about being advocates, you know, enabling conditions to, you know, to move towards those directions and issues to mediate when necessary. And this is when we have improvement in health, because improvements in health requires a secure foundation in these basic prerequisites. So the summary of health and all policies are the roles and responsibilities of the government to bear responsibility for the health of the people. It says this in the preamble of the Constitution, that the government shall provide for the general welfare of the people, and what that means. And that means how we deal with health authorities at all key levels, who are the key actors, intergovernmental organizations and structures, and the concepts of principles that relate to human rights and obligations to strengthen accountability that contributes to sustainable development while acting on the consequences of those policies and determines health and well-being. Several interrelated HIC policies that the US is starting to adopt now, developing and structuring cross-sectional relationships, incorporating health into decision-making processes, enhancing workforce capacity, coordinating funding and investments, integrating research, evaluation, and data systems, synchronizing communications and messaging, and implementing accountability structures. Again, Alma Ata Declaration of 1978 that came up with health for all in terms of primary care. Number one, education concerning prevailing health problems and the methods for prevention and control. Promotion of food supply and proper nutrition, adequate supply of safe water and basic sanitation, maternal and child health, immunizations against major infectious diseases, prevention and control of endemic diseases, which SARS is going to be an endemic disease in the next few years. Appropriate treatment of common disease and injuries, and provision of essential drugs. The building blocks of international law: diplomacy, treaties, conferences, rules of warfare, collective security, movements of world government, social cooperation, universalism, relationships, and the 9 core international human rights treaties. Iceberg, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in the World, which the U.S. is finally about to, some of these we haven't even signed off on, quite frankly, in the United States. The International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. These dates given were how these dates were ratified around the world. The International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment of Punishment. Convention on the Rights of the Child. International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. Protection on all persons from enforced disappearance. And Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it's just remarkable that our Senate has not ratified, a number of these things. In fact, the government of Somalia, as it exists now, which hadn't had a stable government in 30 years, signed off on the Convention of the Rights of Children. And we haven't even done that in this country. So, we got a lot to think about in terms of metacognition. So, again, as we think about obligations under humanitarian law, equality and non-discrimination, rights of life, liberty, and security of the person, administration of justice, right to privacy, expression. These are things that are worth promulgating, okay? Prevention of human rights violations ensures social justice for all people, advancement of human development, prevention of human suffering. It provides for health security, rights, and conditions that enable individuals and populations to attain and enjoy the full potential for human life. Dignity. I say this because within the Office of Community Health, at our retreat last summer, we decided that dignity had to be a part of our mission statement, that we had to support human dignity. And so when we look at dignity, the loss of dignity, we're talking about degradation, humiliation, shame, loss of self-respect, loss of pride, abasement, mortification, and indignity. And again, the value of human dignity, the violations are pervasive events with potential severe and sustained negative health effects on physical, mental, and social well-being. Health is not a commodity, and life and death matters across the lifespan. And we have to care for those who are left out by reaching, pursuing, empowering, and making. Reaching for those left out using universal policies, pursuing the measures for groups with special needs, empowering those left out by upholding human rights, ensuring access to justice, promoting inclusion and cohesion, ensuring accountability, and making human development resilient, addressing climate change, maintaining human well-being in post-conflict situations, combating violence, addressing epidemics and shocks, and promoting social protection. And last but not least, folks, why do I do this? Because I'm not getting a whole lot of money, that's for daggone sure. I do this for the generation that is coming behind me, coming from my African tradition and background and culture and people of color in general, like indigenous people from the world. I stand on the backs of so many who suffered before me, and it's to those ancestors and people who sacrificed so much for me to get to this point. I do this for the generation that's coming behind me. Thank you, and references upon request, and thank you for your adept attention. And I hope it wasn't going too fast, but I hope your metacognition was challenged and that you're thinking about thinking while thinking to improve your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martín. We will now move into our Q&A. If any of our attendees have any questions for Dr. Martín, please utilize the Q&A tab within Zoom, and I will facilitate those questions for him. So Dr. Martín, we did have a question kind of early on. I think it was actually in your first learning objective. When you talk about upstream, what about the role of culture that drives? What about the role of culture that drives policies and procedures?
What about the role of culture?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to define that in terms of what it means to have a culture of health and a culture of well-being and a culture of dignity. If the culture does not support those things, then I think it's an ill-suited culture. And I think that it has a lot of discriminatory practices to it. So that culture has to be questioned, and what those motives and what those practices are. Does that make sense? We have a culture of denial in many ways of human rights issues and things of that nature. And as they say, denial is more than a river in Egypt.
Okay, that makes sense to me. If there's a follow-up question, they'll go ahead and put it in the Q&A tab. We also had a question regarding how do we close the empathy gap?
Wow, that's a tough one. And that's one of the things that I'm working on right now as I uncover the issues, the newest studies from social neurosciences and other types of things. As I said before, the three functions of the mind are thinking, feeling, and wanting. And the reason why I challenge folks to use metacognition for a moment was to think about thinking to improve your thinking. And I say that because we've had an imbalance where, because of the shock doctrine that's existed in this country and the issues that are taking place, people have become more reactive than proactive. And so when people become more proactive, and I understand the survival mechanism, but they jump from interpretation of their feelings and they jump from feelings to motivation and desires. And so the cognitive issues are missing from that in terms of what's positive or negative, particularly if it's the perception of threat or fear, and what happens with that neurochemical hormonal cascade that takes place in the body. So there has to be a balance between thinking and feeling, because thinking informs your feelings about what's right and what's wrong, what's positive and what's negative. And when thinking and feeling is in alignment, then it's easier to figure out your desires and your motivations for moving forward with this. So that means at some point, the education and training that we have under this cultural model, or this colonist model, we have to decolonize our education system. Because from the perspective of African American studies, again, the famous African American scholar Carter G. Woodson once said that African Americans were not kidnapped and brought here to be educated. We were brought here to be slaves and to be trained. And so we have to look at this notion of what training and what education is and where the balance lies. So finding that balance between one's emotional state and how one deals with one's fears is an proper concern, because we all know that when there's a perception of threat, our body automatically responds to that perception of threat to fight, freeze, or run away. We fight or we run, or we freeze or do nothing. We disassociate. And beta endorphins produce a good feeling about that, some eustress to that, so it becomes notable. So it comes down to what resources do you have in your community, around you, and personal resources. Like once a Native American colleague and I, we were talking about our issues, and we talked about, in doing this work, what first aid kit do we carry with us every day when we walk out of the house? Because we know that we're going to be under assault. And we know that by the time we return home, that psychic shield that we put ourselves in is going to have all kinds of cracks and breaks in it. So how do we heal again to restore that sense, to go back out and continue dealing with this oppression and stuff we deal with? So if that person would like to send me an email, I'll gladly send them some resources and some other things about mindfulness and intentionality, and how we think about not only metacognition, but also think about metaphysics. What is the ultimate issues of the world, and what are those realities of the world, and how do we transform and bring back indigenous ways of knowing, to counteract, the nonsense that we've presented with. I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, thank you. And then we also did have a request about having the article that you mentioned regarding the task force that Biden and Sanders are putting together.
I'll make a note to that, and I'll send that to you.
Yeah, and I'll get it posted on our website.
Okay.
We also, I know we have a few people on by phone, and so we have Christina, who had raised her hand to ask a question. So we're going to go ahead and open her mic, or unmute her, so that she can ask her question directly.
Sure.
So Christina, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Sorry, I accidentally raised my hand.
Hello.
Christina,
Sorry,
there you go.
Hello, Christina. I'm Dr. Martin, and I'm listening.
Sorry, I accidentally raised my hand.
Oh,
okay.
Okay. You're
Thanks,
excused.
Christina. Okay, do we have any other questions for today? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martín, for your time and expertise today. We appreciate all of your efforts towards creating true health equity in New Mexico. And thank you to all of our attendees who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you back next week as Amy Whitfield will present the inequity of professional feedback, the need and process of building an equitable evaluation process. Hope everybody has a great afternoon.